The new psychology was at that time sweeping through us all. We were all influenced. We were all concerned about fantasy or wishful thinking. I formed the resolution of always judging and acting with the greatest good sense.
He was saying that all youth at that time were trying to escape from wish fulfillment dreams. They got that from Freud, and they wanted to, in one way, spit on the images of their youth and go on to they knew not what, but anyway leave that behind because it was juvenile.
Lewis was writing a long poem called Dimer. In it, he portrayed belief in God as a tempting illusion, one that had to be resisted. But he found that in his own life, he wasn't so certain. The question of God's existence would not let him go.
I was, at that time, living like many atheists in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. Why should creatures have the burden of existence forced on them without their consent?
More than anything, Lewis wanted to write poetry. And for that, he needed the security of an academic career. He applied for teaching jobs at Oxford, but college after college turned him down.
I was attacked by a series of gloomy thoughts about professional and literary failure. Such a rage against poverty and fear and all the infernal net I seemed to be in that I went out and mowed the lawn and cursed all the gods for half an hour.
Lewis's first ambition, a burning ambition from the age of about 15, was to be a poet, a great poet.
I could not say simply that I desired not my fame, but that of the poem, nor was the feeling a disinterested love for Dimer simply as a poem. It was a desire that something that I recognized as my own should publicly be found good.
His hopes were finally fulfilled in 1925. Magdalen College made him a fellow. The next year, he found a publisher for his long poem, Dimer. Success at last. But it was not enough.
All the books were beginning to turn against me. Indeed, I must have been as blind as a bat not to have seen, long before, the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. The most religious were clearly those on whom I could really feed.
The poetry he really cared about was not Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein. All these years, the greatest pleasure he ever had was from Christian poetry. Things like Spencer, Milton, all of these great poets. And yet he found out that he was reading them, as he later said, with the point left out. The same thing was happening with his friends. The people he thought he should have liked were the college atheists. But the ones he really liked were Tolkien, a practicing, very devout Catholic. Owen Barfield, who asked all the right questions.
I can only describe it as the great war between Barfield and me. When I set out to correct his heresies, I find that he had decided to correct mine. And then we went at it, hammer and tongs, far into the night. Night after night.
Barfield believed that the imagination plays a very important part in how we know. He rejected the model that science is the only way to truth, to acquiring truth. He felt that the imagination lay behind even the work of science. It gave meaning to propositions. And so he felt that Lewis was missing out in his whole approach to reality on what made knowledge possible.
I was suddenly compelled to read the Hippolytus of Euripides. O God, bring me to the sea's end, to the Hesperides, sisters of evening, who sing alone in their islands where the golden apples grow. And the Lord of oceans guards the way from all who would sail into their night blue harbors. Let me escape to the rim of the world, where the tremendous firmament meets the earth, and Atlas holds the universe in his palms. For there, in the palace of Zeus, wells of ambrosia pour through the chambers, while the sacred earth lavishes life, and time adds his years only to heaven's happiness. I was off once more into the land of longing, my heart at once broken and exalted as it had never been since the old days. I was overwhelmed. I called it joy.
When Lewis talks about joy, he talks about something that he labels the central theme of his whole life. But what he means by joy is not the satisfaction of a desire, but a desire that is more desirable than any satisfaction.
There was no doubt joy was a desire. But a desire is turned not to itself, but to an object. I had been wrong in supposing that I desired for joy itself. All value lay in that of which joy was the desiring, the naked other, unknown, undefined, desired. I did not yet ask, who is desired?
The very experience of joy that Lewis had was an arrow that led to the target of belief in God. Lewis argued innate, deep desires do not exist unless they correspond to something that can satisfy them. If there is hunger, there is food. If there is sexual desire, there is sex. If there is curiosity, there is knowledge. So if there is the desire for this thing that is beyond this world, there must be something beyond this world.
Lewis was still resisting, but growing tired from the struggle.
The fox had now been dislodged from the wood and was running in the open, bedraggled and weary, the hounds barely a field behind. The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears to be a moment of wholly free choice. I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus. Without words, and almost without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay. I felt myself being given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I chose to open. I felt as if I were a man of snow at long last beginning to melt. Drip, drip. And presently, trickle, trickle. I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. Total surrender. The absolute leap in the dark were demanded. I gave in and admitted that God was God. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. It must be understood that my conversion at that point was only to theism, pure and simple. I knew nothing yet about the incarnation. The God to whom I surrendered was sheerly non-human.
Lewis believed there was a God, but he did not yet have a specific way to worship him. He was attracted to Hinduism and Christianity.
I think Lewis made a conventional objection to Christianity that it's so much like other religions. Dying and rising gods, and redemption from sin, and the triumph of life over death. These seem to be common patterns, so they could be explained psychologically instead of historically. And then one of his friends, who was an atheist, who looked at the life of Christ and said, "Rum thing seems to have really happened once." And that shocked Lewis.
If he, the cynic of cynics, the toughest of toughs, were not, as I would still have put it, safe, where could I turn? Was there then no escape?
He was reading G.K. Chesterton, because Chesterton tells, in effect, the history of the world and how it was leading up to the incarnation.
A great man knows he is not God, and the greater he is, the better he knows it. The Gospels declare that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. The most that any religious prophet has said was that he was the true servant of such a being. But that the Creator was present in the daily life of the Roman Empire, that is something unlike anything else in nature. It is the one great startling statement that man has made since he spoke his first articulate word. It makes dust and nonsense of comparative religion.
He begins to read the New Testament in Greek. He begins to understand that the New Testament is not just a set of stories, but actually a witness to the presence of a historical human being who embodied the Spirit of God, that this person did not sin. And so this was only possible if this person truly was God in human form. The claims that Christians believe actually came from Jesus are either absolutely true, and this argument stems from Chesterton, either they're absolutely true, or Jesus needs to be confined to the lunatic fringe.
To believe in some sort of a God is fairly comfortable. It's more inconvenient to believe in a God who's so specific and so particular that you can say, there he is in history, there are his words, there are my responsibilities, I can't make it up.
As I drew near to Christianity, I felt a resistance almost as strong as my previous resistance to theism. As strong, but shorter-lived, for I understood it better. At each step, one had less chance to call one's soul one's own.
Lewis simply did not understand where Christ fitted into it until finally that night in 1931 he had invited Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, two of his closest friends, to Magdalen College. It was a windy night. They went along before dinner. They walked along Addison's Walk, talking about mythology. They stayed up to 4 a.m., and Tolkien did his work well.
What Tolkien showed me was this: that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. I was mysteriously moved by it. The reason was that in pagan stories I was prepared to feel the myth as profound. Now the story of Christ is simply a true myth.
His imaginative questionings and his imaginative longings came together by focusing upon the Christian Gospels as outlined by Tolkien and Dyson.
He was a literary critic. And as such, he said, I know myth when I see it, I know legend when I see it, and I know an eyewitness account when I see it. I recognize metaphor when it's there. All of this is in the Bible. All of it is inspired. But far from all of it is literal history. Well, Dyson and Tolkien pointed out that the only difference was, we don't know that Osiris walked the earth, but Jesus left footprints. People saw him and talked about it.
As we continued walking, we were interrupted by a rush of wind, which came so suddenly on the still, warm evening, and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We all held our breath, appreciating the ecstasy of such a moment.
I think it would be a mistake to think that argument converted C.S. Lewis, because he thinks that we have to be oblique. We can't look at things directly. They escape us. This is what his attempt at introspection taught him. When you're thinking, and now you start to think about your thinking, you're not thinking about the original object anymore. You know, I'm thinking about baseball. Now I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about baseball. I'm not thinking about baseball anymore, you see. It's very elusive. So Lewis understood that we had to have an oblique approach. As he put it, you have to sneak past the watchful dragons of self-consciousness.
I know very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I went with my brother to have a picnic at Whipsnade Zoo. We started in fog, but by the end of our journey, the sun was shining. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. I had not exactly spent the journey in thought, nor in great emotion. It was more like when a man, after a long sleep, becomes aware that he is now awake.